Michael Anthony's story inside Van Halen is not one of loud arguments, public fights, or dramatic exits. It is a story defined by silence, patience, and loyalty in a band famous for excess, ego, and chaos. When people think of Van Halen, they think of Eddie Van Halen's revolutionary guitar work, David Lee Roth's wild charisma, and later the tension that split the band into eras. Very few people immediately think of the bass player standing aside, smiling, singing high harmonies, and never demanding attention. Yet for decades, Michael Anthony was one of the most important reasons Van Halen worked as a band at all. He was the glue holding the rhythm together, the voice that lifted choruses into stadium anthems, and a calm presence in a group known for volatility. He never chased headlines or power. He showed up, played his part, and believed that loyalty would protect him. But history would prove otherwise. As Van Halen grew from a loud club band into one of the biggest rock acts in the world, the balance of power inside the group shifted. Those who spoke the loudest gained control. Those who stayed quiet slowly lost it. Michael Anthony did not lose his place overnight. He lost it piece by piece, contract by contract, interview by interview, until one day he realized that the band he helped build no longer saw him as essential. This article is not about attacking Van Halen or tearing down its legacy. It is about understanding how one of rock music's most dependable musicians became marginalized inside his own band, not because he lacked talent, but because he chose peace over conflict. At the age of 70, Michael Anthony is not seeking revenge or rewriting history with anger. He is simply allowing the full story to exist. And sometimes, that quiet truth is more powerful than any scandal. Long before Van Halen sold out arenas or redefined hard rock, Michael Anthony's relationship with music began in a simple, disciplined environment. He grew up in a household where music was not treated as a fantasy or a shortcut to fame, but as a skill that required patience and responsibility. His father, Walter Sobolewski, was a trumpet player who practiced regularly at home. That sound, steady and controlled, filled Michael's childhood and shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a musician. Music was not about attention. It was about showing up, practicing, and doing your part. Michael followed a traditional path at first, learning trumpet through school music programs. This gave him a strong foundation in timing, structure, and musical theory long before he ever touched a bass guitar. When his family moved to Southern California in the mid-1960s, those lessons deepened. At Dana Junior High School in Arcadia, he joined a marching band, where teamwork mattered more than individual flair. You had to listen to others. You had to stay in time. You had to be reliable. These early experiences shaped Michael's entire career, even when he later entered one of the most unpredictable bands in rock history. As a teenager, rock music began pulling him in a new direction. Guitars and drums dominated the local scene, and many young musicians chased the spotlight by trying to become lead players. Michael made a different choice. Instead of competing, he looked for the space that needed filling. That space was the bass. He began learning the instrument in a rough, improvised way, borrowing a guitar, removing strings, and teaching himself from scratch. It was not glamorous, but it showed commitment. His father noticed this dedication and helped him upgrade to better equipment. Michael studied bass players who valued groove and feel over ego, musicians like Jack Bruce and John Paul Jones. Even though he was left-handed, he trained himself to play right-handed, showing a flexibility that would later define his role in Van Halen. By the time he was ready for something bigger, he had already built a mindset focused on service rather than dominance, a mindset that would both define and cost him dearly. Before Van Halen became a global name, it was part of a rough and competitive Southern California club scene, where reputations were built through live performance, not image. Michael Anthony spent years grinding through the circuit, playing school dances, small festivals, bars, and local events where the audience did not care about future fame. They cared about whether the band could hold a room. During this time, Michael played in several groups, searching for a place where he truly fit. One of those bands, Snake, would become especially important. Snake was not polished or industry-ready. It was loud, raw, and built for live energy. Michael played bass, but he also handled lead vocals at times, forcing him to develop confidence as a front-facing performer. This experience gave him stamina and consistency, skills that do not show up in songwriting credits but are essential to a band's survival. Around the same time, Another group was making waves in the same area. Mammoth, led by brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen, was already gaining attention for its intensity and musicianship. The two bands crossed paths through shared venues and events, including a crucial night at Pasadena High School. During that show, Mammoth's public address system failed, threatening to shut the performance down entirely. Michael stepped in and offered Snake's equipment, so the show could continue. On the surface, it was a simple act of professionalism. In reality, it was a powerful statement. In a competitive scene, he chose cooperation over rivalry. The Van Halen brothers noticed. Not long after, Mammoth faced another problem. Their bassist, Mark Stone, was gone, and the band needed someone who could lock in with Alex's drums, support Eddie's explosive guitar work, and add strength to their live sound. They remembered Michael not just for his playing, but for his dependability. He was invited to jam, and the chemistry was immediate. Beyond his bass work, Michael brought strong backing vocals that instantly expanded the band's sound. Harmonies became a defining weapon, giving the music lift and power. With Michael Anthony in place, Mammoth transformed into Van Halen, and the classic lineup was born. Once the lineup solidified, Van Halen did not slowly climb the ladder of success. They exploded. The late 1970s Los Angeles club scene was unforgiving, but Van Halen dominated it, packing venues like the Whiskey A Go-Go and Gazzarri's night after night. Eddie Van Halen's guitar work stunned musicians, while David Lee Roth's charisma commanded attention. Yet beneath the spectacle, something quieter was happening. Michael Anthony was making the chaos work. His bass playing was tight, grounded, and relentless, providing the stability needed to support Eddie's unpredictable style and Alex's thunderous drumming. Van Halen's music was not just loud or fast. It was precise, and that precision came from a rhythm section that never collapsed under pressure. Michael's real secret weapon, however, was his voice. His high harmonies became inseparable from the Van Halen sound, lifting choruses into something massive and unforgettable. When the band released its self-titled debut album in 1978, the impact was immediate. Songs like Runnin' with the Devil and Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love were driven by a rhythm section that never wavered. Michael's bass lines did not show off, but they held everything together. His vocals on tracks like Jamie's Cryin' were not background decoration. They were essential. Critics noticed, musicians noticed, and fans felt it, even if they could not explain why. Behind the scenes, Michael was treated as a full partner during the early years. According to former manager Noel Monk, profits and responsibilities were split evenly. Michael did not demand special treatment or push for control. He simply showed up and did his job. As the band's success grew, so did internal tensions. Egos expanded, creative conflict intensified, and power dynamics began to shift. Through it all, Michael stayed neutral, believing that loyalty and professionalism would protect him. He focused on keeping the band steady, while others fought for dominance. What he did not realize was that in Van Halen, power did not belong to the quiet ones. And as the band reached its commercial peak, the man who had helped anchor it was about to face the most damaging moment of his career, be why the mid-1980s. Van Halen was untouchable. The album 1984 was not just successful, it was a cultural event. Songs like Jump, Panama, and Hot for a Teacher dominated radio, MTV, and stadiums worldwide. But behind the scenes, control inside the band was consolidating. Decisions that had once been shared were now increasingly dictated by the Van Halen brothers and David Lee Roth. Michael Anthony, despite being a founding member and a defining voice in the band's sound, found himself drifting away from the inner circle. The critical moment came during the 1984 tour. According to Noel Monk, Michael was presented with a legal agreement backstage just hours before a show. The timing was deliberate. The pressure was intense. Standing around him were the other members of the band. The message was clear, even if it was not spoken. Sign or risk everything. The contract stripped Michael of future songwriting credits and royalties and made the change retroactive. This meant he would no longer receive credit or income for material he had already contributed to. It was not about whether he wrote riffs or lyrics. It was about ownership. In that moment, Michael Anthony lost his. Years later, he explained why he signed. He did not want to derail the tour. He did not want to fracture band. Above all, he wanted to play music, so he chose peace over confrontation. That decision cost him millions. 1984 went on to sell over 10 million copies in the United States alone, generating enormous revenue through licensing and reissues. Michael saw almost none of it. Publicly, nothing changed. He stayed on stage, toured, recorded, and smiled. Privately, his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer an equal partner. He had become, in legal terms, a hired musician, yet he did not go to the press or accuse his bandmates. He carried himself with the same professionalism he always had. Even as his contributions were quietly devalued, his silence protected the band, but it also erased his leverage. For years after the 1984 contract, Michael Anthony continued doing exactly what fans expected. He played the shows, sang the harmonies, and stayed out of the spotlight. But something subtle began to change. It was not in the lineup or the music at first. It was in the way the story was being told. As Van Halen's classic era slipped into the past, interviews became the new battleground. In retrospective conversations, Eddie Van Halen made statements that shocked longtime fans. He suggested that Michael was not a fully independent musician, implying that his bass parts had to be shown to him and that his role was minimal. For many listeners, these claims did not align with decades of live performances. This was the same bassist who had played flawlessly for years and the same vocalist whose harmonies defined the band's sound. Michael did not respond with anger. When he did address the accusations, he did so calmly, denying them and pointing out that no evidence existed to support such claims. Rehearsal tapes, witnesses, and live recordings told a different story. Still, the damage was done. New fans hearing those interviews without context began assuming the narrative was true. Michael's professionalism, once his greatest strength, was now being used against him. Communication between Michael and Eddie slowed, then stopped. There was no dramatic confrontation, just silence. After Eddie's death in 2020, Michael spoke with regret, not bitterness. He expressed sadness that there was never a chance for closure. The pattern became clear in hindsight. Contracts took his credits. Interviews took his reputation. Silence took his chance to correct the story in real time. Michael Anthony did not lose his place in Van Halen through a single decision. He lost it slowly, while trying not to make things worse. By the late 1990s, Michael Anthony's role in Van Halen had been quietly reduced. During the recording of Van Halen 3 in 1998, he played bass on only 3 of the album's 11 tracks. Eddie handled the rest. Publicly, nothing was explained. Privately, the message was clear. Michael was no longer essential. Despite being sidelined in the studio, he continued touring with the band, maintaining the image of unity on stage. In 2004, the Best of Both Worlds compilation included new tracks, yet once again Michael did not play bass, contributing only backing vocals. That same year marked his final tour with the band, a reunion with Sammy Hagar. According to Hagar, Michael was required to accept reduced pay and sign a contract treating him as a hired musician. After nearly 30 years, he agreed. Then came the final blow. In 2006, Eddie Van Halen decided to replace Michael with his son, Wolfgang. Michael did not learn this through a conversation or a phone call. He found out online like the fans. Years later, he described the moment as deeply hurtful, not because of the replacement, but because of the lack of respect. There was no goodbye, no thank you, just absence. That moment marked the unofficial end of his time in Van Halen, not with confrontation, but with silence. For a man who avoided conflict his entire career, the ending was painfully ironic. After leaving Van Halen, Michael Anthony did not fade away. Instead, he rebuilt his career with people who wanted him there. His friendship with Sammy Hagar became the foundation of this new chapter. Together, they launched projects like The Other Half, Planet Us, and eventually Chickenfoot. These bands allowed Michael's bass playing and harmonies to be front and center again. Chickenfoot's debut album reached the top 10 on the Billboard charts, earning strong reviews and proving that Michael was not just surviving outside Van Halen. He was thriving. Later, with Sammy Hagar in the circle, he continued touring and recording, achieving success decades into his career. There were no contracts taken away, no credits erased, just music Michael never issued a manifesto or demanded apologies. He let his work speak for him. After Eddie Van Halen's death, discussions about a tribute briefly raised hopes of closure. Michael Anthony was willing to participate, and his involvement was seen as essential. Without his harmonies, any tribute would feel incomplete, but old tensions, creative disagreements, and health issues prevented it from happening. At the same time, Eddie's legacy became closely protected by Valerie Bertinelli and Wolfgang Van Halen. Valerie has made it clear she does not want a biopic made during her lifetime, fearing that Eddie's life will be distorted for entertainment. Wolfgang has rejected what he calls toxic nostalgia, emphasizing dignity over spectacle. While this protection prevents exploitation, it also means there may never be an official retelling that fully acknowledges everyone who helped build the band's legacy, including Michael Anthony. Once again, silence shapes the story. Michael Anthony never set out to expose anyone. At 70, he is not driven by anger or a need for validation. He is simply allowing the full picture to exist. He has never denied Eddie Van Halen's genius or minimized the band's success. He has only clarified his role: loyal without leverage, essential without ownership, professional without protection. His story is a reminder that in music, as in life, being quiet does not mean being unimportant. Van Halen may have moved on without him, but the music world never did. In the end, Michael Anthony left with dignity. And sometimes that quiet truth is the most revealing thing of all. Michael Anthony's early life explains a lot about the kind of man he later became inside Van Halen. Born in Chicago and raised in California, Michael grew up in a working-class family where showing up, doing your job, and staying loyal mattered more than chasing attention. Music was always part of his life, but he never dreamed of being the loudest person in the room. He learned bass because it felt natural, not because it put him in the spotlight. When he joined Van Halen in the early 1970s, the band was still grinding through small clubs, loading their own gear, and playing for crowds that barely knew their name. Even then, Michael stood out in a quiet way. He handled backing vocals, helped organize rehearsals, and kept things steady when chaos threatened to take over. Eddie Van Halen was already a musical genius. David Lee Roth was a born showman, and Alex Van Halen drove the rhythm with intensity. Michael became the glue, the one who filled gaps without asking for praise. As the band exploded into global fame, his role became even more important. Van Halen's sound was not just Eddie's guitar. It was also Michael's bass lines and his high harmonies, which gave the songs fullness and balance. Tracks like Runnin' with the Devil and Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love depended on his vocals more than many fans realized. Yet as success grew, so did power struggles. Eddie became the creative center, Roth the public face, and Michael stayed where he always had, supporting, steady, and silent. When tensions rose, he avoided taking sides. That choice kept the band moving forward, but also slowly erased his influence. By the time the band reached its commercial peak in the early 1980s, decisions were no longer shared equally. Business meetings happened without him. Creative choices were made behind closed doors. Still, Michael didn't complain. He believed loyalty meant patience, and patience would be rewarded. That belief would later cost him dearly. The 1984 era marked a turning point. While fans saw success, sold-out tours, and iconic albums, the band's internal structure was changing fast. Contracts were rewritten, ownership shifted, and control became concentrated in fewer hands. Michael signed what was put in front of him, trusting the people he had stood beside for years. He didn't demand lawyers. He didn't argue percentages. He assumed fairness was already built into brotherhood. Looking back, that moment defines his entire story. It wasn't weakness. It was faith in something that no longer existed. As Van Halen moved forward, Michael's role